look, we've talked quite a bit this morning about all the various elements of digital transformation, how the people side, the culture, some of the technologies involved, the challenges of super funds, especially with working with legacy systems. But underlying all aspects of digital transformation is the data, and all aspects of the data to drive the digital transformation. We're all probably familiar with the phrase, data is the new oil. And according to the World Economic Forum report in 2020, the total amount of data created, captured, copied, and consumed in the world was 59 zettabytes, the equivalent of 59 trillion gigabytes. It was first used, that phrase, by a British mathematician and a marketing mastermind at Tesco in 2006, Clive Humby. But the important part of that quote, Humby went on to say, the data is valuable, but if unrefined, it cannot really be used. It has to be changed into gas. Sorry, oil is valuable, but if unrefined, it cannot really be used. It has to be changed into gas, plastic, chemicals, etc., to create a valuable entity that drives profitable activity. And so with data, it must be broken down, analysed for it to have value. So when I start off talking about that quote, most organisations no longer need convincing that data might be very valuable, and in fact as valuable as oil. But James, in your experience, do they appreciate the efforts needed to refine the data to really extract the value from it?
Yeah, it's a good question, Stephen. I think on the whole, organisations are becoming more and more aware of the effort needed to refine data properly, but I wouldn't say right now that it's universally appreciated by organisations. I think refining data, that's really when we talk about managing it, being able to audit it, to be able to view the data lineage for compliance purposes, and then get it down into the hands of downstream users and teams. So yeah, I guess to explain that, two ends of the spectrum that we've seen are that some organisations are really clued up on data and how to manage it. They've got internal teams, they've got operations teams, data management teams, they've got well-resourced IT teams, and they're very structured in terms of how the data comes into the organisation, how it's managed in those teams and systems and processes, and in summary, they're really high on the data maturity scale. And then other organisations that we talk to are slightly lower on that spectrum. They're just starting to have issues around compliance and the pressure that regulators are putting onto them. And there's a lot of manual processes and spreadsheets in their processes as well. And for these organisations, they're aware of the challenge and the effort needed to refine that data, but they're seeing it as something which is really large and maybe something which they can't quite tackle yet. But I think there are some organisations out there that are still unaware of the effort involved to refine data. And this might be whether there's a bit of a disconnect between those who are at the coalface for the organisation's data activities and the decision makers. So oftentimes everything's appearing really calm on the surface, but under the water, the duck's feet are going a million miles an hour. And that's kind of some of the manual processes maybe which exist below the waterline that not everyone's aware of, and the effort to refine, the effort that goes into refining data at that point. So it takes a bit of work to get to the point where you can document those details and then show where the issues or the cracks might exist. And I think in terms of extracting value, often it's just time. You know, when you put in processes, people, technologies that allow analysts and the teams to have the room, I guess, to get insights from that data and identify the patterns and anomalies and the way to do things better. If you've got that from organizations, if they prioritize that, and if teams and individuals are no longer spending their time chasing data and manually manipulating data, it's really, at that point, you can step back and you can start to actually analyze the data and create value from it.
Yeah, that's really important. And I should have said at the start that James and I are going to run this more of as a discussion. James and I do this occasionally for AlphaCert, Alpha Chats. You might have seen us on LinkedIn talking about data-related issues. So, but I'd certainly also invite the audience. So use the chat, use the Q&A to take part in the conversation. And I love the image of the duck, and that gets used a lot, but I think it's such a powerful image, and it reminds me of one of the comments made by a panelist this morning. That an organisation might have done digital transformation and have a great data entry website, an app for people to communicate, but then at the back end somebody's busy typing it up, and it goes into a normal manual process. Another quote here: the senior vice president of Gartner, Peter Sondergaard, took the concept of data is the new oil even further. And he said that information is the oil of the 21st century and analytics is the combustion engine. Well, how do you understand that and the relevance of that to superannuation funds and asset owners?
Yeah. Another nice quote there, I think. And I'd completely agree with that statement. Information is nothing, though, without interpretation, analysis, distillation, and presentation. So that's where your analytics and the combustion engine comes in. But I think there's also another step in there, which is maybe the refining. If you're getting the oil out of the ground and that's the information, then you've got a refinement plant maybe in the middle, and that's doing all the data cleansing, the data validation, to make sure that when the information gets to that combustion engine, that it's really humming. And I think there's a few ways we can think about that. There's the old garbage in, garbage out analogy as well. So the process of data analytics, it really starts right back with looking at how that data is managed, and turns from information which is coming in a raw format to something a bit more refined that gets in the hands of your teams and your processes, or into your processes and your systems. And then that refinement is really how you make sure that that data is true and correct, how you validate it before you supply it to your downstream users in those analytics systems. And I think all of the upfront activity and the time spent on that data sourcing, that streamlining, that automation, that needs to occur really upfront before you can fill up that tank and start the engine in your analogy. But absolutely, I think once you have a set of data which you can 100% rely on, that's where the value can be added again with those analytic systems.
And I think that reliability is really important. And if we don't have that, I have seen, be a digital transformation, system transformations failing, not because of the actual the technology being applied, but that the data underneath that technology isn't right, and that the whole trust and the integrity of the digital transformation programs at risk. And I guess that I think about some of the other challenges. So yes, we all acknowledge data is the new oil, and a lot of people talk about data, information, wisdom. So those sort of phrases get used a lot in organisations these days. Somewhere in their strategy, and we'll talk a bit about strategy a bit later, but somewhere in their strategy will be data-driven. It's a great phrase. But so what's stopping them? What are some of the challenges holding organisations back from being data-driven? And what are some of the solutions that you've seen?
Yeah, I think just to talk about the challenges, first of all. So one of the key challenges that we see more regularly probably than we'd like to when we talk to organizations is when you come into an organization, there's no fundamental agreement, maybe not on all the data, but certainly on some parts of the data, about what the source of truth is. And it might be that one team recognizes a particular source and a particular couple of data points within that as the source of truth, and they're basing their market values or their numbers off those, and another team sees it differently. So I think number one is to have everybody on the same page. That's a real challenge and something to overcome. And then secondly, it's sorting out at an organization level where the data comes from, what the source of each data point is, and each area of data is, who's responsible for that data, and how it's defined. So is it in a data dictionary? Is it within a data catalog? So getting all of those in place and agreeing on all of those are probably challenges for organizations. And then I think buy-in from the top, that can also be a challenge. So if you're rolling out a data strategy, you really this needs to be driven from the top. And when it is, that allows you to put in place what you need in terms of the people, process, technology, the teams for the capacity, the governance processes, your systems that you need for data quality. And it's always important once you are a data-driven organization to keep maintaining that buy-in and reaffirming that buy-in by demonstrating value, I guess.
A couple of things. Yeah, look, there's a couple of things there I just want to pick up on. You talk about the source of truth, and a couple of examples you gave are very important examples on the investment side, but that's just as, one would think that on the member side, it should be a little bit easier, but the amount of time and effort I see spent by people trying to work out how many members have I got. I mean, something very fundamental as that. You end up spending more time arguing about, is it this number or that number? And to your point, that's where the energy goes. And it comes back to confidence in the data. And if you're so busy arguing about basic data, such as my member numbers or how many new members have I had in the last 12 months or 1 month or something, then you can't really move forward with your implementation of your more interesting data strategies.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And I think, sorry, go on.
Yeah, just in terms of the solutions, being data driven, really goes back to putting in place that data strategy and elevating its importance. So in terms of solutions, it's systemization really and automation of the process and the technology up front. So that's making sure the right people are in place, the right technologies in place, and ensuring those governance layers are in place across those technology points that you put in as well. So what we see and what we'd strive to put into an organization is a self-service model. So you've got a self-service model from a consistent and trusted source, and that really allows the scalability of those data requirements out to the business. And that can be delivered via BI tools or other specialist tools as well.
That's interesting. And the sort of being data-driven and that buy-in from the top, I think, we heard a lot this morning about how do you engage properly with senior management and the boards of super funds around digital transformation and helping them understand what it really is. And I think what I'm hearing, the next step is also they need to really understand the role of data in a successful digital transformation. So that is really important. So what are some of the other ways we might be able to get that buy-in from the top? I mean, something we hear about a lot, but sometimes that's really challenging, especially if people don't value the investment in some of the data initiatives.
Yeah, I think a couple of ways that we've seen it. The role of data, I guess, be really elevated within the organization. One customer that we were working with, they had a mandate from the top to set up a data council, and that data council was put in place, and that was responsible for assessing all of the inflows of data into the organization. And at the moment, I'm just talking investment data, but it could equally be applied to the member side, and also the outflows of data out of the organization. So putting this in place, giving the mandate to put something like that in place, and giving clear ownership to individuals and teams within the business. I think that's one example of how that rolled out in terms of giving a very clear guideline. And I think it also comes, that buy-in from the top also comes in support for not just business cases and budget for larger pieces, but also if you can get some approval to do pilot projects or proof of concepts, get something out quickly, prove a bit of value, and then be able to move forward with that.
Yeah, I like that, actually, that last bit, because so often we've seen huge, big projects to build a data warehouse or a data lake or whatever, and 3 years later, millions of dollars later, the board or the leadership is starting to lose faith in the ability of it to deliver because of that huge, big project. Whereas if we go for the proof of concepts, the pilots, try something, gain a bit of confidence, roll out a bit more, and that can really help accelerate the buy-in from the top.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And the data council, the example you gave, is that people from across the business as well as technologists, or is it purely limited to the technology folk?
Yeah, I think it was absolutely a mix of business and technology in there, and also key SMEs. So you might have SMEs on the custodial side or the market data side, or across various systems that would also sit in on that. So they knew this is a piece of data. I know where it's coming from, and I know the best route that we need to go to get it into maybe our warehouse or something like that is to go either through the operational data store systems, or it can go directly into the warehouse because we're not doing any transformation or logic across these data sources. So they're key subject matter experts, and then you need the business and tech to then assess those on top as well.
Mm. And you mentioned before in your answer about BI tools, and I think, you know, we've all seen super funds over the last 4 or 5 years as part of this recognition that they want to be data driven, hiring data scientists, buying Power BI licenses, powering Tableau BI licenses, employing people to build dashboards. Is that being data driven? Is that sufficient? Or what else should they be thinking about as they're doing that?
Yeah, they're great tools, absolutely, these BI tools. But yeah, I wouldn't say that hiring some people with specialist skill sets and implementing those BI tools will necessarily make an organization data driven, but it's an important cog in the wheel, right? So it can be part of that overall solution. So yeah, going back to what we talked about, the results that come out of those tools, once you do implement them and you've got your data scientists looking at them, they're only going to be as good as what's going into them on the other end. So, you know, you have to put in that work up front to refine the data to make sure it's all validated, checked, trusted, correct before it flows into your BI tool, so that you're going to get the right thing out the other end, and it's going to be correct. You're not going to do yourself any favors if you're putting data in the hands of users that hasn't been 100% verified, and we know it's accurate because it's gone through 10 steps of checking on the way in and that type of thing. And I think,
yeah, go on.
Yeah, I think with this, you know, having these tools is never a silver bullet, but once you can trust that data within them, you can really start again to extract that value.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And the other part of that, I think, is, yes, you can build wonderful dashboards, but then again, the dashboard in itself is not being data driven. It's, are they producing actionable insights? Are they actually producing answers to questions the business is asking, not what the data analyst thinks the business should be asking? And it needs to be built in collaboration with the business. And the other thing that I've seen work really effectively is really thinking about the user experience. I know if I talk to a super fund or an asset owner, they all want to be customer centric. They all think very carefully about their UX and their CX when it's thinking about their consumers, their customers, but they sometimes don't put that same sort of thought into how they think about their business users, and they just get served up with whatever they get. Whereas, you know, to your point about getting stuff that's actionable and getting buy-in from the top, it's much easier to get that buy-in if the executive, if the manager of a certain area gets given exactly what they need to do their job, as opposed to a big dashboard to have to search through to find what they're after. So that's, I think, an important part of getting confidence in the data program, but also getting buy-in from the top.
Yeah, and I think, yeah, really good point there. You never want data for data's sake or dashboards for dashboard's sake to be what you serve up through these tools. So that actionable insights is really important. What does the business actually need, and what can they take action on?
Look, there's enormous amount of pressure on superannuation funds and wealth management firms at the moment, and it's very nice to talk about what they need to do around data, and they got to get better at it. So what are some of the pressures? What are some of the challenges they're being faced with that they, you know, that will help, that being more data driven will actually help them?
Yeah, there's many and varied at the moment, aren't there, Stephen? Yeah, there's a lot of pressure on from quite a few angles at the moment. And, you know, obviously operational and cost pressure, that's always a big one. A lot of funds are being asked to do more with less as they aim to reduce the cost to their members. So there's pressure to do that without increasing headcount. And from a technology perspective, you can do that by systemizing, by putting in place automation, by taking a lot of that manual heavy lifting out of the hands of your users and putting it into processes. I think another angle for pressure at the moment is the complexity of investment data in particular, and I'm sure there's, I'm not so familiar on the member side, but I'm sure there's lots of complexity on that side as well. And it's only increasing. The more and more data sources you have, the more providers you have, you're only going to get asked more questions and to provide more and more insights, really. So if you've got the base set of data there for investments, you're now being asked to overlay ESG data on top. How does that join in with your holdings data? How does all my look-through data come in from external managers, and how do you turn that around to 4 levels of look-through within a certain time frame and get that out to your users? How do you get all that additional enrichment data in from your various market data providers, and provide those analytics across fixed income securities and the like to give them the extra points that you need from the likes of a Bloomberg or a Refinitiv or a AlphaCert. So yeah, lots of additional data sources, lots of complexity in tying all of that data together and making sense of it into a cohesive area for each individual asset class or security. And then I think, regulatory, that's a massive one. So huge pressure in terms of a couple of examples around PhD reporting and the increase of APRA reporting as well. And then in terms of data transparency, I think there's that links in with the regulatory reporting, but there's a big focus on transparency as well. So what's your look through to each level of the structure? What's your exposure to counterparties and issuers? The whole landscape, I think, and the appetite for transparency, that just requires a lot of heavy lifting in order to do that on the way in or within systems, so that you can get to that answer or get to what you need really quickly. So yeah, lots of pressure from all angles there.
Yeah, and look, that very much resonates with the member side as well. And just in case people aren't aware, PhD is the policyholder disclosure requirements, portfolio holding disclosure requirements that are coming in fairly soon after about 7 or 8 years of being promised. And look, the regulatory push for more data is important. APRA have increased the amount of data they're collecting many times in the last few years, and more recently from September this year, there's another new set of data requirements for APRA, and I know funds are grappling with that because it's getting down to a level of granularity they previously haven't thought about. And I want to pick up on the multiple sources and talk about that a little bit from the member side as well. You talked about, it's not just custody data now, raw custody data, it's all that other stuff coming in to augment it or to enhance it and to use it. And we're seeing exactly the same on the member side. It wasn't that long ago where 80, 90, maybe even 100% of the data that funds got to look after their members was coming out of the Met Core registry system. And what we've seen over the last few years is an incredible growth in data from other sources, whether they be CRM, call centres, websites. Funds are now starting to look at unstructured data out there, sentiment in social media, turning contact centre conversations from voice into text and then analysing that. So the types of data and the volumes of data are increasing dramatically. I heard one fund say not long ago that, probably a couple of years ago, 80% of data they used was from the core registry, and that's down to about 70% now, and they expect to drop below 50%. Not that they're getting less data from their core registry, but the volumes and the quantity of data from other sources is just growing dramatically. And that complexity and that data is being used for digital transformation, for customer experience. So it is important that they get that right. So that's really important. Right at the start, you talked about some of the different organisations you've worked with, and some are quite mature, some are less mature on that. And I guess it is important for organisations to think about where they are on that. And I know AlphaCert recently published a data management maturity model that sort of goes to helping organisations with that. Can you talk about that a bit? What were some of the motivations and the uses of that data management maturity model?
Yeah, sure. It really helped, I think, when we're opening up a conversation, when we're starting to talk to customers, and there's a wide spectrum in terms of who we talk to, from asset owners to asset managers, and they all sit in varying places on a data maturity model. So we really developed that data management maturity model to identify stages from the beginning where organizations are just starting out. There's lots of manual processes right through to data leaders, and that's where everything is humming. You've got systems in place, you've got capability in terms of people and knowledge, you've got policies and you've got processes, and it all exists to manage that data effectively and get it in the hands ultimately of the users and teams who it needs to be with in a timely manner. I think one of the most important things, though, Stephen, going through that process and having that conversation with customers is by putting those stages in place, it allowed us to have a roadmap to allow them to say, well, at the moment, yep, we're just beginning. We want to get to level 4 data leader. We want to be a data leader, but there's a roadmap, there's stages in place, and there's various activities that we can take place at each one of those stages. It's a crawl, walk, run type of mentality. It's not a, come on, tomorrow we want to be in the cloud on the best systems and we want to have the best analytics in place, let's go. It's definitely allows us to have that conversation, and it might be that not every part of your organization needs to be on the top stage as a data leader. You might choose to put all the systems in place, but you might not need to have quite the capability or the resources in place across each one of your pillars potentially to support that. So you don't necessarily need to be at the top end for everything within that.
Yeah, look, I think it's important, and it's interesting you use the phrase crawl, walk, run. We heard that this morning as well, and the concept of maturity. So one of the big challenges for organizations is a data transformation or a digital transformation, becoming data driven, being able to be a digital savvy organization. It can all be very daunting, especially when they're encumbered with lots of legacy systems and largely outsourced. So having some sort of tool like a maturity model to help work out where we are today, and then where do we want to get to, and how do we build along that, I think is really valuable. And it also helps, I think, with some of the internal dialogue. It sets up a bit of a common language that we can use to have that conversation about data and digital and things like that, which is all part of getting that top-down approach as well, and that buy-in from the top to be able to talk about it. And it reminds me a bit of the line in the paragraph in Alice in Wonderland, where Alice comes along and sees the Cheshire Cat, and she asks the Cheshire Cat, "Which road should I take?" And the Cheshire Cat says, "Well, where do you want to go?" And Alice says, "Well, I don't know." And the Cheshire Cat said, "Then it doesn't matter which way you go." And I think that's a bit like organisations with their data and their digital. Unless they know where they're going, it's very hard to know which road to take.
Yeah, I think, Stephen, just to add on that, we'd go into engage with some customers and organisations, and the first thing they'd want to talk about is getting their data into an analytics tool, as we were talking about. So, I want everything in Power BI dashboards. I want everything in reports, and it's about putting in place a framework to actually take somebody on the journey from where you are now to getting something that's really actionable in some of those BI tools.
Yeah, no, very, very important. And I guess that sort of neatly sort of fits into the idea of what your data strategy is and how that relates with your overall corporate strategy. So what are you seeing from that? And is there need for a separate data strategy? Is it just part of an overall corporate strategy with data somewhere buried in it?
Yeah, I think data stands alone as a strategy piece, but it's very close to the corporate strategy. So a data strategy should really enable the corporate strategy or help it to be achieved. So say your corporate strategy is something around your basis point reductions in fees to members, and that might be part of the corporate strategy. How do you get there, and how does the data strategy help you implement, again, people, process, technology, things like increasing automation and straight-through processing in the data activities that can help to not reduce headcount, but maybe keep your headcount stable as you grow, as you automate more of your daily processes. So I think, yeah, it definitely is an enabler, but I don't think it sits quite within the corporate strategy.
Yeah, that makes lots of sense, and I think it's important to not see them as independent, but rather interdependent. And yes, the corporate strategy is the key mission and the goals of the organisation. And as you say, the data strategy enables that. I think that's critical to have that interdependence between them. So we've talked a lot about some of the challenges and the need to be data driven. So what are some of the things you've seen in organisations that are good at managing data, doing data, if you like?
Yeah, another good question. I think it sounds cliche, but I'm going to say it anyway. It's really treating data as a strategic asset. I think that's one of the things that organisations that are doing well and have a good approach to data, they give it the treatment it deserves. And once you have that mindset to treat data as a strategic asset, it gives you the buy-in all the way from the top. It allows you to focus on that upfront agreement on all aspects of the data, including governance and where it's sourced from, what's the hierarchy of data sources, who's the owners, what are the data definitions. Because once you have that strategic lens across it, then you can layer on all of those extra pieces. And then the organizations who truly believe that data is a strategic asset, they're action orientated. So they're not just paying lip service. They're actually going to take those insights and messages as intended, and they're going to get the most success out of any of their projects there. I think from a practical sense, recognizing data as a strategic asset with the complexity and the growing landscape, you need to manage that data effectively. So again, single source of truth across your investment data and also your member data. So each domain is its own source of truth. And then I think really you need to understand how the data is used by all of your individual departments. So you need to get really close to your performance, your risk, all of those individual teams within the organization, and get a very clear sense of how they're using the data, how they're interlinking it through, and then you can deliver well on the data, basically.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And one of the things that came up a couple of times this morning was the problem of silos. And I think that problem of silos, when you're trying to do data, digital, those sort of things, which do cross over those boundaries, and by having that more holistic view of an organisation tackling the data and making sure the data analysts, the data engineers are working closely and understand why the data is being asked for too. I think that's a really important one. So rather than just having the business say, oh, we need data X, Y, Z, and leaving it at that and go away and doing it. If the data team says, well, why do you want it? What's the business objective? They might be able to help by getting a different type of data set that might be more valuable, or making sure the data is served up in the way that's most valuable to answer that business outcome. So the why is really important.
Yeah, and that also comes back into your resourcing and your capacity. So do you have the right resources in place, the capabilities in place that can ask those questions and understand what comes back in terms of the answers, and also challenge and play devil's advocate when you need to?
Yeah. And one of the things I've seen in the last year or two is this sort of balance between having data controlled, managed, security, all very important aspects, but more and more organisations want the ability to play with the data, to encourage people to have access to the data, use the data. So how do we balance that tension between those two?
Yeah, it's an age-old problem, this one, really, tension between access and control. So on the one hand, you're probably always going to have parts of the business who want just uncontrolled access to raw data, and they want to be able to bring in other sources of data and combine it all together. And on the other hand, there's some parts of the business who just require very structured reports. So I think it's going to be struck differently depending on every organization, but ultimately you need to be able to work hand in hand with your IT and your security to deliver the data into the hands of the users with those appropriate controls. So in terms of tension, I think the tension is really going to be a byproduct of the level of maturity or data maturity within the organization. So if you have those good governance processes in place, if you have the appropriate skills and people, and you've got the right data policies in place, you're going to land in a place where you know what data is coming into the organization, you know how to control it and put controls around it, and you know what's going out of the organization in terms of appropriate controls as well. You've got everybody bought into that data strategy, and the right governance and controls, I guess, exist. And we talked about shadow IT, Stephen, as well. Do you do you want to have a
well, I think so, because I guess what I've seen, if you are too rigid and too sort of tightly controlling your data, and don't let people use what they want to do and play around with it, you'll get these shadow IT operations popping up with spreadsheets or other tools, and that probably really undermines the data strategy in the organisation. So to try and avoid that, you do need to recognise the different needs. And I was thinking about it when you were talking about the maturity model, and within organisations, different teams will have different maturities. But I guess even within teams, different people will have their own different level of maturity around data, understanding data, wanting to use the data. And a good data approach, a data governance framework and data strategy will allow for different maturities within organisations, both at the team or division level, but also right down to the individual level, with the appropriate controls in place, because we don't want APRA coming along or ASIC coming along and dealing with data security issues.
All those role-based access controls and everything like that to set up, officer and manager type of roles, really important as well.
No, that's terrific. Look, thanks for that. There's no questions from the audience. I'm not sure if that means that everyone's asleep or people have been just following along and we've answered all their questions. Hopefully the latter. Really appreciate you joining me today for this conversation, James. Thanks very much. People can have a look at the AlphaCert Data Management Maturity Model on their website, and look out for more Alpha Chats where you can see James and I talking about various topics.